بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا. Verse 33 of chapter 33, verse 22. The translation of which is, verily you have in the Prophet of Allah an excellent model for him who hopes to meet Allah on the last day and who remembers Allah much. You just heard the legal side or the legal consequences that can be taken because of that movie, which has been released a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to take you back a little bit in history. Let's go back around 1500 years ago. At the time of the Prophet of Islam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. The Prophet spent 15 years of his life after the proclamation to be the Prophet of Allah in Mecca. That was the city he was born in, the city he was raised in, but that was also the place and the city which gave him the most grief, gave him the most problems. His followers and he himself was persecuted basically on a daily basis. But the attitude he showed towards those people, the ultimate belief in his mission, in his Lord and his followers, stands in direct contrast with the attitude people are showing today on the streets of so-called Muslim nations. People you see burning the flags, people you see burning the embassies, and causing chaos and ruckus all over the place. Now, if we tell these things to people on the street, today our audience is mostly Muslim, but if you tell that to, let's say, Christian people or non-religious people, they're just going to look at you and tell you, okay, that's a funny thing to say because that's not what I see on TV. That's not what the reaction of, let's say, people in Cairo or in Syria is. That's completely different. It's completely the opposite. They're just going crazy. So you're going to have a hard time explaining that to him. The best thing is to go back to the sources. If you want to explain something, if you want to explain, for example, Christianity, you go back to the roots. It's the same thing with Islam. You want to explain Islam and what the actual teaching of Islam is. You go back to the book of Islam and you go back to the teachings, and no better person can explain the teachings than the Prophet himself. Peace be upon him. Now, if you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, it was on a daily basis. He was persecuted. People threw dust at him. People threw garbage at him. They didn't let him pray in peace and harmony. So what was his reaction? People might say, he killed a lot of people. But that was not his reaction. The initial reaction and the initial response he gave to his followers was just simply migrate. Go to a place where you can practice your religion freely. Go to a place which can offer you that peace and harmony that you need to practice your religion. So many Muslims did that, but the persecution didn't stop there. The Meccans or the opponents of the Muslims at that time, they followed the Muslims to those places. And they spoke to the generals and the governors of those places to send those Muslims back to Mecca so they can keep persecuting them. But those who remained in Mecca, they had it even harder. For them, life became a living hell. They were boycotted for a good 3 years. And it was during that period that the Prophet of Allah, peace be upon him, lost his beloved wife, his first wife, Khadija. She didn't have to die. So Khadija was put into a situation where the circumstances developed in a way that, life is life. So she died because of these circumstances. Now, if somebody is responsible for the murder or the death of your innocent wife, people get really, really angry. And the only thing that is on their mind is revenge. But what did the Prophet, peace be upon him, do? Did he revenge the death of his innocent wife when he had the chance to? We'll come back to that later on. Now, when he realized that nobody would listen to him in Mecca, that's what prophets do, or people do, they go to other nations, they go to other towns, they go to other places. So that's what the Prophet of Allah did. He went to a place called Taif. It's a city around 60 miles located to the southwest of Mecca. So he went there to preach the message of Islam. Obviously, people knew about him that there's a lunatic, God forbid, in Mecca right now, proclaiming to be the prophet of Allah or the messenger of God. So the chiefs of Taif, they welcomed him, but at the same time they said, listen, we don't want to hear anything of whatever you have to say, so thanks but no thanks. Then the Prophet of Allah went to the people of Taif. But they, following into the footsteps of their chiefs, they didn't just stop by just denying the message or saying, okay, we don't want to hear whatever you have to say, but they went a step further. To please their chiefs, to please their leaders, they set vagabonds and those street boys after the Prophet and his companion Zad. So they started stoning the Prophet. And it didn't just stop outside the gates of Taif. No, they went miles and miles outside the city until the Prophet reached a stage where his shoes, in some narrations it said, were trenched with blood. How hard and profoundly he was bleeding. In that moment, imagine, what would you do? Somebody is stoning you, somebody is cursing you, somebody is causing you so much grief. Obviously, people get angry. We get angry a lot. Somebody smacks you on the shoulder, you get angry over here. But this is stoning. This is not just mere verbal abuse. This is physical abuse. So in that moment, an angel of God came to the Prophet, and he said, O Prophet of Allah, if you tell me right now, Taif was located between two hills. So he said, if you tell me right now, I can crush Taif within a second. As if the city never existed. Everybody, every single soul living in that city, destroyed. But prophets are teachers. Prophets are fathers of the nation. And like any father, they don't want their children to suffer for no reason. So this is what the Prophet said. He said, no, I hope that of these very tormentors would be born those who would worship the one true God. Now, the last time I told this incident, a brother came up to me afterwards and he said, it's all good and fine, you can explain this and you can share this incident, but what about those people who actually have no religious affiliation, who don't believe in religion? They don't believe in angels. It doesn't matter if you believe in angels or not. It doesn't matter if you're religiously affiliated or not. The fact is that if he had the chance to, he could have said yes, simply yes. Forget about the aspect of the angels. He could have attacked Taif later on when he had the chance to, but he didn't do that either. So the fact is that despite being tortured, despite being stoned, he remained steadfast, he remained patient. Let's carry on. Blasphemy, as brothers Jonathan just spoke about. Blasphemy, unfortunately in some countries today, and Pakistan is one of them, is punishable by death. Now that is carried out in the name of a person whose life and whose actions are completely the opposite. Let's take a look at that life. Now, there was two people, a Muslim and a Jew, fighting one day, and the Jew said by him who gave Moses superiority over all the prophets, or over all the people. So that, the Muslim, being a bit temperamental, he raised his hand and he slapped the Jew. So the Jew went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he told him what happened. And so the Prophet of Allah, peace be upon him, he called that Muslim. He said, he confronted that Muslim. He said, listen, this is what the Jew complained about. Is it true? So the Muslim said, yes, O Prophet of Allah, it's true. I couldn't take it because he said, by Moses who gave superiority over all the people. And we know, and everybody knows, that you are superior to all the prophets. Now the Prophet, peace be upon him, this is what he said. He said, do not give me superiority over Moses. For on the day of resurrection, all the people will fall unconscious, and I will be one of them. But I will be the first one to gain consciousness. and will see Moses standing and holding the sign of the throne of Allah. I will not know whether Moses has also fallen unconscious and got up before me, or Allah has exempted him from that stroke. During an expedition to the town of Banu Mustalik, a fight arose, or a quarrel, an argument arose between among the Muslims themselves. There was a Meccan Muslim, he was an ex-slave, and from the people from Medina, there was another Muslim. So these people started fighting amongst each other. When the Meccan Muslim, the ex-slave, called his helpers, so did the Muslim from Medina. Now among those people was one person called Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul. And everybody knew he's a hypocrite. He sided sometimes with the non-believers, he sided sometimes with the Muslims, but every time the Muslims went somewhere, he was in there trying to instigate some sort of anger or some sort of fight among the Muslims or the people outside. Now he saw that opportunity. He thought, okay, this is my chance to actually get the people from Medina on my side. So he started to instigate the people. He said, you have gone too far in your indulgence to the refugees. Your good treatment of them has turned their heads, and now they are trying to dominate you in every way. He went a step further. He said, let us return to Medina, then will the most honored among its citizens turn out the most despised. Now you can guess who he meant by the most honored, obviously himself, and the most despised, God forbid, he referred to the Holy Prophet. Now the Muslims, they figured out what he was trying to do. So they noticed, and they stopped right away. Somehow, the news reached to the Prophet. Now the Prophet called Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul and his friends, and he confronted them. He said, listen, this is what I've heard. Is it true, yes or no? And obviously, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul, he said, no, this is not what we said. And his friend said, no, that's not true. But truth prevails. So somehow, the news started to spread. And people knew that this is not true. This is what they said. What happened was that Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul had a son who was also called Abdullah. Now young Abdullah heard the news that this is what my father said. Instead of going to other people, he went to the Prophet straight, peace be upon him. He went straight to the Prophet and said, O Prophet of Allah, this is what I heard. He said, my father has insulted you, death is his punishment. If you decide so, I would rather have you command me to kill my father. If you command someone else, and my father dies at his hands, I may be led to avenge my father by killing that man. Maybe I incur the displeasure of God in this way. But, said the Prophet, I have no such intention. I will treat your father with compassion and consideration. And that was exactly what he did. The next and the last example I would like to present today is probably one of the most shocking. The Prophet of Allah ﷺ had an uncle. It was called Hamza. Now, what Hamza did was he killed Utbah during the Battle of Badr. That was the first encounter between the Muslims and the Meccans. Utbah had a daughter. She was called Hinda. Hinda was the wife of Abu Sufyan, one of the chiefs of Mecca. When Hamza killed Utbah, Hinda did not like that at all. So she wanted to avenge her father's death. At any price, at any cost, may it take what it wants. So she hired an Ethiopian slave. That slave was called Bashi. And she told him, or on the promise of freedom, she commanded him that this is the man you have to kill. Well, she gave him three options. It's either the Holy Prophet ﷺ, Ali, peace be upon him, or Hazrat Hamza. Now Washi, he waited during the second encounter, that was the Battle of Uhud, behind a hill, behind a stone. When he saw Hamza, he was unprotected. he killed him. After the battle, Hinda came to Washi and she demanded to see the dead body of Hamza. Because obviously, that was the man who killed her father. So Washi took her to the dead body of Hamza. And this is what Hinda did. Hinda and the other harpies she had brought with her from Mecca mutilated the bodies of the slain Muslims. She cut open Hamza's abdomen, plucked out his liver, and chewed it up. Waqdi, the historian, says that she made a fire in the battlefield, roasted Hamza's heart and liver, and ate them. Not satisfied with this, she cut the limbs, the ears, the nose of Hamza, strung them into a necklace, and entered Mecca wearing it as a trophy of victory. Quite shocking. Now Washi, that's the person responsible for the death or for the killing of the beloved uncle of the Prophet, peace be upon him, later on accepted Islam. When he met the Prophet, peace be upon him, for the first time, this is what happened. And I quote, "After the Battle of Uhud, I continued to live in Mecca for quite a long time until the Muslims conquered Mecca. I then ran away to Taif, but soon Islam reached that area as well. I heard that however grave the crime of a person might be, the Prophet forgave him. I therefore reached the Prophet with Shahadatain on my lips." Shahadatain means that proclaiming that there is no God beside Allah and that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is his messenger. So the Prophet saw me and said, "Are you that same Washi, the Ethiopian slave?" I replied in the affirmative. Thereupon he said, "How did you kill Hamza?" I gave an account of the matter. The Prophet was moved and said, "I should not see your face until you are alive because of the heart-rending calamity that fell upon my uncle at your hands." And I said that in the previous lectures I delivered, that this is the translation I found. If you look at the Arabic, the words, "I should not see your face until you are alive," might sound pretty harsh, although considering the fact that that's the person he's talking to is responsible for the death of his uncle, you might say, that's fine. But the Prophet, in the original Arabic, it says, "Is it possible?" He asks him, he asks Washi, "Is it possible? Could you do that?" Washi could have said, "No, no Prophet of Allah, I want to stay here in your presence." And I highly believe, and I truly believe, I'm 110% sure that the Prophet would have said, "Okay, if this is what you wish." But he asked him, "Washi, is it possible for you? Could you not come in front of me because of the heart-rending things or thing you have done to my uncle?" When a famine broke out in Mecca, that's another thing. These are the people, we're talking about the people responsible for the migration of all the Muslims, responsible for the death of their family members, for their friends, for their companions. When a famine broke out in that town, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, sent aid to Mecca, just to help his people. Throughout 23 years of his ministry, every single day of his life, none of those days he spent peacefully. Every year, every day, somebody tried to kill him, somebody tried to harm him, somebody hurt him, somebody insulted him, but not a single day went by where he wasn't grateful for every single day he spent on this planet. As I mentioned earlier, that it was during that age, during that time, these 23 years, that he lost a lot of his friends, and lost his beloved uncle, he lost a lot of his companions, his first wife, but it was also during that period that he had the chance to take revenge for every single one of these lost lives. It was during the conquest of Mecca, which happened in the 8th year of the Hijrah, meaning 8 years after the migration. He entered Mecca with 10,000 soldiers. And guess how many people he killed? Or guess how many people he took revenge from? None. Not a single one. He could have. If anybody in history had raised that allegation, why did he do that? People would say, that's the most unlogical thing to say. 23 years of persecution, of torture on one side, and you're complaining that why did he, take revenge? Completely against logic. Now when the Prophet entered Mecca, he performed all the rituals. And after the rituals, he asked the people of Mecca. He said, you've seen what you've done with us the past 10, 13, 23 years. You choose what's your punishment. What should be your punishment? He's talking to people, imagine you're talking to a whole city which deserves punishment for every single crime they've done. And I'm not talking about stealing, I'm not talking about just merely insulting. These are really, really serious crimes. One of those people was also responsible for the death of his daughter. I'll come to that later on. So he asks the people of Mecca, you choose, what should be your punishment? Now the people of Mecca, they were pretty smart as well. They said that we expect the same treatment as Joseph gave to his brothers. As you know, that Joseph forgave his brothers. Despite the fact, they threw him into that well and left him alone. So Joseph forgave his brothers. And that's exactly what the Prophet did. He said, no harm, no punishment for you today. لا تثريب عليكم اليوم. However, if you take this general amnesty aside, there were a few people for whom the Prophet said that because of the grievous crimes they did, they actually deserve the punishment of death. And one of them was Habar. Habar was the person that was responsible for the death of his daughter, of the Prophet's daughter, Zainab. What he did was he cut the girths of the camel as Zainab was sitting on. So she fell to the ground, and because she was pregnant at that time, of course, the child was lost, and because of the injuries, she suffered death as well later on. And that was just one of those inhumanities that person committed. Now, that person also accepted Islam. What happened was that he came to the Prophet later on. Just like Washi came to the Prophet, he also came to the Prophet and said that, O Prophet of God, I ran away from you and I went to Iran. But the thought came to me that God had rid us of our pagan beliefs and saved us from spiritual death. Instead of going to others and seeking shelter with them, why not go to the Prophet himself, acknowledge my faults and my sins, and ask for his forgiveness? The Prophet was moved and said, Habar, if God has planted in your heart the love for Islam, how can I refuse to forgive you? I forgive everything you have done before this. I would like to conclude with an extract from the last sermon of the Prophet ﷺ, famed in history as the farewell address. This is a summary of what Islam stands for. It's a reflection of the Holy Quran in every single aspect and action of the Prophet during his life. I have not mentioned any quotes from the Holy Quran except the one in the beginning, intentionally, because there is a narration of Hazrat Aisha and later on, after the demise of the Prophet, when people came up to her and said and asked her that, oh Aisha, how was the Prophet? How was his character? What was he like? And she answered that, have you not read the Quran, the Holy Quran? He was an exact embodiment of the teachings of the Holy Quran. So, in his last sermon, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, O men, lend me an attentive ear, for I know not whether I will stand before you again in this valley and address you as I address you now. Your lives and your possessions have been made immune by God to attacks by one another until the day of judgment. O men, you have some rights against your wives, but your wives have also some rights against you. Your duty is to provide for them food and garments and shelter according to your own standard of living. Remember, you must always treat your wives well. God has charged you with the duty of looking after them. You brought your wives to your homes under the law of God. You must not, therefore, insult the trust which God has placed in your hands. O men, you still have in your possession some prisoners of war. I advise you, therefore, to feed them and to clothe them in the same way and style as you feed and clothe yourselves. If they do anything wrong which you are unable to forgive, then pass them on to someone else. They are part of God's creation. To give them pain or trouble can never be right. O men, what I say to you, you must hear and remember. All Muslims are as brethren to one another. All of you are equal. All men, whatever nation or tribe they may belong to, and whatever station in life they may hold, are equal. While he was saying this, the Prophet raised his fingers, or his hands, and joined the fingers of his hand, like this, and said, even as the fingers of the two hands are equal, so are human beings equal to one another. No one has any right, any superiority to claim over another. You are as brothers. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black superiority over a white, except by piety and goodness. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that the Muslims constitute one brotherhood. Nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim which belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it was given freely and willingly. Do not, therefore, do injustice to yourselves. Proceeding, the Prophet said, and he asked the people present at that time, he said, do you know what month this is? What territory we are in? What day of the year it is today? The Muslims said in reply, they knew it was the sacred month, the sacred land, and the day of the Hajj, that is the pilgrimage. Then the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, even as this month is sacred, this land is inviolate, and this day is holy, so has God made the lives, property, and honor of every man sacred. To take any man's life or his property or attack his honor is as unjust and wrong as to violate the sacredness of this day, this month, and this territory. What I command you today is not meant only for today. It is meant for all time. You are expected to remember it and to act upon it until you leave this world and go to the next to meet your Maker. In conclusion, he said, what I have said to you, you should communicate to the ends of the earth. Maybe those who have not heard me may benefit by it more than those who have heard. And that's exactly the same message I would like to give you today. That convey the message, convey whatever you heard today to those people who couldn't be here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that informative speech. So those of you who couldn't make it on time, I'm just going to tell you what happened today. We started off with a recitation of the Holy Quran. Then we had a speech which introduced our community, Ahmadiyya Muslim community, by the president of AMSA, Raza Sahib. Then we had our first speaker, Mr. Jonathan Butterworth, who gave a very intellectual lecture, you can almost call it, on freedom of speech and a bit of critical thinking of how we should define it. Then, as you've just heard, there was a speech by Raza who's going to be a missionary for our community. Again, a very informative speech about different aspects and different points of Islam and life of Prophet Muhammad. So I'd like to conclude with by saying that we have a stall set up outside. There's some books and leaflets for you guys if you. So we're going to go into our question and answer session. Just before that, I want to let you guys know there is a stall set up outside with some books and leaflets. You're more than welcome to take some home. So now I open the floor for any questions. If you guys have anything in your mind you want to